Hi, my name is Robert Espinosa. I'm the MSD coordinator for the City of San Antonio. I'd like to welcome you to the virtual public meeting that we're conducting here tonight. I'm being accompanied by Mr. Kenneth Tram. He'll be discussing the MSD that he's trying to obtain. I'll be covering the MSD process, and Mr. Tram will be covering site-specific information about his MSD site. And let me explain what an MSD is. An MSD is basically a tool that allows a landowner to utilize to redevelop their land and restricting groundwater use. Things that we'll be covering tonight consist of the purpose, the process, and the benefits of an MSD. Mr. Tram will be covering the MSD technical side of the application. He'll be covering items that he's worked on, where he's at to date, the next steps. What is an MSD and when is it created? MSD stands for Municipal Settings Designation, created by the state in September 2003. It addresses existing shallow groundwater contamination beneath redeveloping properties. It requires City Council to pass a location-specific ordinance. MSD ordinance restrict the potable use or drinkable water use of impacted shallow groundwater for human consumption. The applicant must participate in one of the cleanup programs administered by the TCEQ or the EPA. A landowner is required to adhere to the following. A deed restriction is required to prevent the use of contaminated groundwater. Number 2, ensure the source of contamination is removed from the site. And 3, ensure the plume is delineated, decreasing, and stable. Okay, on this slide we have a shallow groundwater contamination slide that basically shows how a plume has grown underneath a facility that's known to have a contaminant, and it basically allows people to have a visual of what is contaminated and where the plume, in what direction the plume is flowing. MSD is one step in the cleanup process. An MSD does not excuse the applicant from reducing risk to the public. Responsible parties are always responsible for cleanup per state regulatory requirements. An MSD does not affect you. An MSD does not affect your property. An MSD does not affect your water well. There is no requirements on you. Drinking water supplied by the city is not affected. City requirements for an application. Enrollment in a state or federal cleanup program. Through investigations confirming that groundwater plume is stable and decreasing and delineated. Source of contamination has been removed, and the final one would be a third-party engineer or a geologist must certify the MSD application. In the following slide we have steps for the MSD process. We have basically from the very start a pre-application meeting is conducted. We allow the consultant to come in and we talk about the process, what the site is. It's a lengthy process. We go through the review process, we go through the city council approvals. Ultimately, there's an ordinance at the very end that's issued for the MSD. The benefits of an MSD: protects the public from consumption of contaminated groundwater. Number 2, encourages cleanup of contaminated sites. Number 3, promotes redevelopment for underutilized properties. The City of San Antonio has an MSD application website. If ever you'd like to take a look at it and browse through it and become familiar with the process, everything you need to know is on that website. Everything that we're covering here today, if you have any questions, we would like you to contact us within 10 days at the email shown. That is my email address, robert.espinosa@sanantonio.gov. Upcoming events will consist of the Community Health and Equity Committee meeting, and we project that to be in November 2020. The next meeting would be the public hearing, and once again we project it to be in December 2020. And finally, the City Council hearing scheduled for January 2021. And now I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Kenneth Tram with Modern Geosciences.
Thank you. So this evening I'd like to cover the following items that you see on the slide as an agenda. The introduction, so you already know a little bit about me, the property information, project background, and then how this fits with the MSD program here in San Antonio, and then obviously encourage you to get any comments or questions to us. As Robert noted, my name is Kenneth Tram. I am a professional geoscientist and have a few other acronyms behind my name, but more importantly, I've worked on MSDs, or Municipal Settings Designations, across the state of Texas, several of them for municipalities. So the site itself is an approximately 1.7 acre piece of property. It's at the northeast corner of Marbach Road and West Military Drive. During the due diligence that I'll explain a little more about in a moment, we identified 2 on-site concerns, a gas station and a dry cleaner, and 2 off-site concerns, a gas station and a dry cleaner. As far as where the site is in San Antonio at large, we're kind of in central west, as you can see on the figure here. And the groundwater gradient, so the direction that the contaminants would likely move, is to the east and southeast. As we zoom in on the property, as you see on this slide, you can see the boundary of the property there in red, and the general location of where the dry cleaner was, and where the gas station was on-site, as well as the off-site gas station and dry cleaner. The white lines that you see here are topographic gradient lines, right? So this is a direction going from west in general to east, and then some slight movement to the southeast, as we'll talk about in a moment. So the investigation itself, or the background for this project, starts in 2013. Evaluating this piece of property as part of their environmental due diligence, in 2013, a Phase 1 environmental site assessment was done. That's a look at all the history, regulatory compliance records, and performance of a site reconnaissance to look for concerns on site. Obviously, from that effort, we found the dry cleaner and gas stations that were noted before. That leads to 2014, when some investigation work is done to identify was there or was there not releases related to these concerns. During that process, over 30 investigation points from soil borings to monitor wells were installed to identify and delineate those impacts, and there were indeed some impacts from that. Groundwater was encountered, usually 15 to 20 feet, depending on where you were at the property. In 2014, a Phase 2 investigation was performed to evaluate if there were releases from those concerns. That included over 30 soil borings and test pits, where we identified alternating layers of limestone and clay, and groundwater roughly 15 to 20 feet below grade itself. The initial monitor wells that were installed, there were 7 of them. Actually, of those, only 3 produced water, meaning this is a low yielding perched groundwater bearing unit, right? So there's not a lot of water here, but there's enough that when impacted, would see the impact when we investigate it. So we identified primarily was the release of perchloroethylene or tetrachloroethylene. Here you'll see we'll use the acronym PCE, very common dry cleaning solvent, still used in 70 to 80% of dry cleaners today. The groundwater gradient was roughly to the southeast, and the underground storage tank had very low levels of impact, and that was in the southwest corner of the site, as we showed on the previous slide. In 2015, after identifying the impact, as part of redevelopment, the old buildings were knocked down and taken away. That included a retail strip and obviously the gas station itself, and the property was then redeveloped as a CVS pharmacy. During that redevelopment process, we were able to remove 850 cubic yards of impacted soil, right, the source of that PCE release that we were talking about. When the building was constructed, we also installed a vapor intrusion control system, so any vapors from any remnant impact would not be able to make its way into the structure. We also removed the 3 underground storage tanks and the 2 dispensers that were related to the gas station. Those were then closed, as we'll talk about in a moment. So in 2015, as part of this effort, we were already having conversations with the City of San Antonio about pursuing and obtaining the municipal setting designation we're talking about tonight. So here's a little bit from those processes we just talked about. So here's a photo of the underground storage tanks coming out of the ground. And then here's a map depicting where you see the hatched areas, where there actually was all the soil was removed, and there were 2 points which were above a default PCL, as we call it, which is that the criteria that we want to clean up to, and it used the most conservative standard. So we got a lot of it, but not every drop. And then this is a depiction of the cross-section of the vapor intrusion control system, which you see in the bottom left being installed. That's all installed prior to the slab going in, and that way we know that the vapors will encounter that first. Looking at the property itself, in preparing for the MSD and to answer the questions that the City of San Antonio had for us, some of what we do is try to evaluate the actual perched unit that we're going to talk about here this evening. Where the MSD would be applied, right? So a 3D is just it has a limit laterally, right? So it's only going to be on the property, and it has a limit vertically. It doesn't go all the way deeper than it needs to into where the perched groundwater bearing unit is. And so looking at that, this slide at least gives you some background of what the perched unit is and the depth of units underneath it that will not allow vertical movement of that impacted groundwater. This is a regional cross-section, right? So it shows, as you can see in red, I've kind of marked out the same thing that was on that kind of, we just zoomed out a little bit so you can see regionally that we have the Navarro clay and we have some other formations. This is how we know we're dealing with a very perched unit that really is probably within about 30 feet from the surface only that is impacted. So during the research to answer the questions that the City of San Antonio had for us, we looked for registered wells. How many potable water wells or irrigation water wells or other water wells are actually within 5 miles of the property? So in this case, there's roughly 300 of those. Of those, 6 were within a half mile. Those were registered, many of them actually still not present today. But all of them were not down gradient nor in the perched unit that's impacted, right? So nobody was going to be exposed or affected by it with the existed, even the registered wells from long ago. As we move further out from the half mile, we noted 35 wells which belong to the San Antonio water system. And then those are all more than a half mile away, and then 1 that's related to the city of Leon Valley. The PST closure, so the petroleum storage tank, as you remember, we removed 3 tanks, we removed 2 dispensers. Those were issued closure from the state of Texas in November 2015. Going forward to 2017, as part of the MSD process and to demonstrate some of the requirements from the city, such as plume stability and plume delineation, we reached a point where the application was deemed administratively complete, but we wanted to finish the groundwater monitoring to answer those last questions. So between 2018 and 2020, additional wells were installed, and we actually evaluated that perched unit to see how much water it could make. So roughly 72 gallons a day would be the maximum draw, meaning that would classify as what we refer to as a Class 3 groundwater bearing unit. So those are very little value in the state of Texas and allow the use of lesser criteria numbers for them. Also, the velocity of the groundwater is actually very, very slow. Roughly speaking, it is less than 0.0002 feet per day. So not moving very fast. Also, we evaluated the site if there was DNAPL, right? So that's dense, non-aqueous phase liquid. We were looking, is there actually concentrations high enough that actually the original free product that was released, that PCE we talked about, if it's actually there below the surface, and it has not been during all the monitoring events. So never been found, which is a good sign. That means that our remediation was effective. One other benefit of monitoring over a period of time like this is we actually got to see the stability of the plume play out. As we look at the source area, we saw a decrease of over 80% from the original concentrations seen at the site near the point of the release. So that's one way that we can judge that we really did get the bulk of the contamination out, and then now time is more of a friend than a foe going forward. This is a depiction of groundwater flow, generally to the southeast, but you'll see a little bit of east and a little bit of south in parts of how the contour lines go, but primarily to the southeast. The next slide is a depiction of where TCE, which is a degradation product of PCE. PCE has 4 chlorines. As it degrades, we move to 3, and that's trichloroethylene, which is TCE. The PCE in full extent of the plume that exceeds PCL levels is shown there in yellow. And then there's a lesser zone that's only on site, which is shown there in green. So as far as reuse of the property, as mentioned before, in 2015, the old buildings were removed and the new building was constructed with that vapor intrusion control system, and it became a CVS pharmacy. After a period of time, CVS Pharmacy vacated the building, and a new tenant is actually preparing to occupy it now, and it's a health services company, which will be a benefit to the neighborhood. And to just add to some emphasis to what Robert talked about earlier, as a timeline, the tool that we're using here tonight, the MSD, initiated in 2003, its purpose to remove groundwater ingestion pathways, the assumption that somebody would drink the water. Such as this case, we have a perched groundwater bearing unit. It doesn't make a lot of water. Nobody would be drinking the water, so it makes sense to put a restriction such as this on it. In 2004, TCEQ created the certification process that you can actually go forward, get it certified by the state. And from 2005 to current, there's been over 430 MSD applications in the state of Texas. So in 2016, the MSD program was formally started here. Why to use an MSD? Some of these were covered again by Robert, but it's good to emphasize them. The main purpose here is to restrict the groundwater from potable use, apply applicable PCL levels, those cleanup criteria that address every other pathway that remains. If we assume nobody's going to drink it, we still have to address everything else. And then it will allow us to actually move properties such as this one towards redevelopment. Beyond even redevelopment, it allows them to actually be investigated. People are interested in spending their money to investigate these properties, bring that information forward, and move through closure in a regulatory program. What an MSD can do is cover each of these items that I have here, which I don't need to go through individually, but remove some of the uncertainty that developers have when addressing brownfields properties. That's a big point. What it cannot do is eliminate all risk. As I mentioned, and as Robert mentioned, you have to address every risk at both the state level and the federal level to move these properties towards closure. This is a depiction of the water wells that are within the half-mile. As we mentioned, there are actually no wells that are active within the half-mile distance. This is the 5-mile, but the half-mile distance closer to the site that are down gradient or actually completed. None of them were actually completed into the unit that we're talking about. As far as the steps to an MSD, obviously the first one is having the public meeting that we're having here tonight. And then moving on to that, there's other meetings that follow. There's a notification period that follows. You have each of the steps there. And then we have the work by the City Council, both the public hearing and then after the public hearing coming later, which right now is scheduled for January, we hope, would actually be the reading of the ordinance. Beyond that, we actually move the site towards closure and wrap up all these issues. Then that means all the right people have looked at it before we get to closure. And with that, I invite you to send any questions or comments. You have my information here, but you also have Robert's. I would direct them to Robert first, and then I'm happy to visit and get into any other detail, and he'll probably bring me into the conversation as needed.
All right, thank you, Ken. If you have any questions about the presentation, please make sure to contact me. Thank you and have a good night.